Good. All right, but let's start, or let me start actually, by bragging a little bit on behalf of the Institute. Because as some of you probably know, this year is actually our 50th anniversary. So we've been around for 50 years. And it was good old Torkel Christensen, former Ministry of Finance in Denmark and former OECD General Secretary, who founded the Institute back in 1969. And the reason I want to brag on behalf of Torkel Christensen and the Institute is actually that he was among the very first economists who sort of pointed towards knowledge being the fourth production factor, the fourth factor in production, just on line with capital and land and labor and whatnot, but knowledge as a factor of production. He was one of the first to point that out. And I think that his statement was spot on back then, and even more so today in our digital economy. It's becoming even more important. So it was spot on back then, but even more important today, I would argue. So this is the report that we've been working with most of the summer. It's been extremely interesting to dive into some of the things, some of the drivers, some of the trends that sort of leads us to think about how higher education should be structurally transformed in the future. And one of the reasons that it is so interesting, of course, to talk about education is that it's something that sort of is part of everyone's life, part of everyone's reality. And a lot of people have opinions on what's right education, how should it be and how should it not be, definitely. But that also means that it's a really, really difficult topic to discuss because people are so invested emotionally in this topic. So that's why I want to say from the very beginning here that we are not trying to be predictive on how higher education looks in the future. We're not trying to say it's going to be like this and it's not going to be like that. We are not trying to be normative around what we think that education should be like in the future. So normativity, no. Forecasting, no. What we're trying to do is to be explorative around what could happen. What are some of the trends that are driving transformation? How could it drive transformation? So we're trying to be explorative, and explorative really is a keyword in this sense, sort of to avoid the whole normativity that tends to take over discussions on education in general. Also, as we go along, you'll probably notice that we will be talking mostly about the dynamics between higher education and a changed future labor market. And we won't really be talking about higher education institutions as research institutions and the researching role in society. That's sort of outside of the scope of this this report. So that's important before we get started. Here are the drivers of structural trends that we've identified in higher education, at least some of them. Definitely we'll be talking about how digital transformation, new technologies and digital distribution is sort of changing how education is organized structurally, how the education institution is digitally transformed, how teaching and learning can be digitized in certain ways. Of course, we'll be talking about how changing job markets and skills needs will be driving change in higher education. Then we'll be talking about the evolving student body and the demographics, and the student body being much more aware of what they expect, what they demand, and have higher expectations for the education experience. We'll also be talking about some of the market dynamics, some of the dynamics on the education market. Maybe we'll see new actors, or most likely we'll see new actors coming in, trying to disrupt some of the traditional business models of universities, some tech giants, some ed tech startups coming in with new business models that sort of shake up conventional thinking. And we'll also be talking about some of the more systemic challenges to the whole value proposition of education. So is an actual higher education degree is that worth the same as it used to be? Or should we start to think differently around that? Quick highlights of what some of the main drivers of change we've identified. I'm not really going to go too much into detail with the specific changes and developments on the labor market or in how we think about work in the digital economy, because that's actually something that we've been working quite a lot with in previous members' reports and not sort of within the scope of this members' report, as long as we agree that we are looking towards a changed future labor market. So we have automation that's going to change a whole lot of jobs, maybe eliminate some jobs, maybe create some new jobs, but definitely changing the way that jobs are done and new job types as a consequence of innovation and automation. Technology, of course, also transforms the labor market in ways such as a platform economy or freelance economy or gig economy, call it what you want, where sort of new technologies allows you to sell or to sell your labor in completely new ways. And I'm not just talking about Uber drivers or sort of these gig jobs. I'm also talking about platforms that allows knowledge workers, project managers, digital workers to sort of sell their labor on a project basis, on a task basis. For example, Upwork, you've probably heard about that platform, some of you. So as long as we can agree that work is changing, job market is changing, society around us is changing, it doesn't really have to be that difficult to also agree that, of course, higher education should change as well. Another thing that's also changing is our approach to sort of our professional career that's becoming much more fluid and much more boundless, so to say. So we have this quote, we have planned for 5 careers in a lifetime. And that might even be a low estimate because we'll be changing jobs and we'll be changing careers much more frequently than before. One thing is because we want to do it, another thing is because job markets are changing, as we just agreed. But be aware that we are writing 5 careers, not jobs. So careers, different careers, not just changing jobs, because we'll be changing jobs so much more than we'll be changing careers. But the whole thing about having, you know, a single career path, that's probably a thing of the past. Also, of course, posing some challenges to the way we educate people to compete in such a world. And with point of departure in what I just presented about the labor market, of course, the whole need for lifelong learning will increase significantly. And lifelong learning, of course, is nothing new really. It's been, you know, hyped. It's been talked about for quite a number of years by now, but it's becoming more and more important as job markets are changing in the way they are. So we're confident that lifelong learning will become a permanent fixture of professional life. And of course, talking about lifelong learning, you could also sort of add the dimension that it's not just about learning throughout life, it's also about life-wide learning, so learning across life, so to speak. All learning, of course, doesn't have to take place in a formal setting that gives you a certificate or gives you a degree or whatnot, especially not in a much more fluid labor market, job markets. That, of course, creates a need for stronger and much more continuous connections between education, what we learn, the skills that we're taught, how we're taught those skills, and the whole, you know, employment side of things. What are the needs? What are the changes in the labor market, in job markets? And it could also lead us to discuss how higher education, traditional higher education institutions could sort of become the heart of lifelong learning ecosystems. Just bearing in mind that, of course, it's not confined to a formal learning setting. So the importance of lifelong learning is increasing, and it probably becomes a permanent fixture of professional life. So now I can maybe cautiously ask the question, if traditional higher education is the best way of sort of preparing people to compete or to survive or to thrive, or choose what word you'd like the most, in a much more unpredictable and fluid job market. My answer to that question would probably be maybe not. Hopefully some of you agree on that. I'm not too sure that it makes sense to think in the conventional way that, you know, the best job lies at the end of a 4 to 5 year higher education, and that you have most of your education for 4 to 5 years before you sort of start venturing out into a 50, 60 year career. Maybe we should think in a new higher education paradigm that's much more flexible, that sort of matches what's going on job markets, what's going on in people's lives. So challenge conventional thinking around what higher education looks like, how it's organized, and the main purpose of it. So I'll look into some of the things that, you know, both pulls and push in the direction of a new higher education paradigm. And we could start talking about the people, the students. They look way different than they've been looking in the past. They have way different expectations. They act way different than we're used to, or at least the way that our systems, our education systems, are built for. So you could sort of say that non-traditional students is the new norm in many ways. So they have very different, very individualized demands, expectations, and they're almost, that's why you see I use the word student consumer on the slide right here. So they're turning into sort of consumers of the education or the learning experience. So looking at, you know, widely looking at student demographics, not just in Denmark, but across Europe, across the States, we see a much wider age span on the student population. So we have younger people going into higher education. We have much more older people sort of maybe doing part-time studying. Then we have people, at least in Denmark and in parts of Europe, that wait much longer before they sort of transitions from high school into higher education. They might want to travel, they might want to have some work experience before they start studying. Then we have digital students, where part of the education, or maybe the entire education, takes place digitally online. We have much more people that has kids, have a family while they study, pretty non-traditional in the classical sense. And then, of course, we have all of the lifelong learners that sort of comes back to education system, revisits education systems to plan for the next career in their career cycle. So that, of course, it challenges the whole one size fits all way of thinking, the one size fits all models and conformity. Yeah, and looking at some of the younger generations that higher education will be battling or will be working with in the future, they are much different than what the systems are geared to. So talking about digital natives, even though I at least try to convince myself that I'm pretty good with new technologies and digitization and all of that, I am not a digital native. Digital natives are the ones, the generations that were born with technologies. Those are the ones who knew how to swipe the iPad before they knew how to go to the toilet. So those are digital natives, and they have very, very different expectations to an educational setting, an educational environment, than most people my age, at least, and older have. So they will explore education alternatives that are on demand and that are just in time, meant the way that I don't see myself going to school from 9 to 4 and learn stuff and then go home. It's the whole on-demand thing and the just-in-time thing that matters. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. And they don't believe, of course, that learning should be confined to the classroom. They want to be able to study in multiple modes. They want maybe go to the classroom for some things because they like the interaction with other students, with the teacher. Then they might want to be able to do some stuff online. They might want to do some blended learning and whatnot. So they want to be able to sort of shop between modes. And of course, I have to say that these characteristics and these numbers on this slide right here is from an American study that was done a few years back. So of course, it's not 100% applicable, for example, to a Danish setting, at least not the number of 75% of Gen Zs say that there are other ways of getting a good education than going to college. Because as you might know, in Denmark, in Scandinavia, in Germany, and many other European countries, you don't pay for education in the same way as you do in the States. So of course, if you ask future students in the US, they of course are much more inclined to pursue other ways, other alternatives of getting an education compared to maybe be in debt for the entirety of their lives afterwards. The next two slides here are actually slides that we've developed, that we've talked about in a consumer context previously. But as we now start to talk about students also being consumers of the learning experience, I'm going to sort of use the next two slides together in a education context. So the whole instant gratification concept, or whatever you'd like to call it, is something that sort of comes out of the digital world that we live in. So we've been spoiled in the digital world that we are able to get everything right now on demand. So instant gratification basically means I want what I want it on demand, and I want it now, and I want it seamless, without delay. So if you have Netflix, for example, which I guess most of you have, you might have noticed that over the past couple of months, Netflix has added a new button to the whole intro going into the series you want to watch, called Skip Intro. So that's instant gratification for you right there. Why do I have to sit through this intro before I can start watching what I really want to watch? So Netflix has added that button to sort of accommodate for this instant gratification demand from the viewers. So it's starting, the whole instant gratification thing it's taking up more and more of our lives, because our sort of patience has been reduced by the digital world as consumers. And not the least the younger generations that have sort of grown up with technology, the digital natives that I talked about just before. There are some ways, of course, to come across or go around this in education that I'm not going to talk too much about. But for example, gamification is a way to sort of accommodate this instant gratification expectation. Gamification in education, where you sort of complete a level, you get the gratification right after you accomplish something. But remember, instant gratification should be sort of merged with this slide right here, where I'm going to talk about liquid expectations. Also a term that sort of comes from consumer heavy industries, or the whole future consumer, but also makes a lot of sense to sort of bring into play when talking about future of education. Because liquid expectations essentially means that now you are comparing service experiences across sectors that you wouldn't compare it across previously. So previously, for example, to take the Uber example, you would compare the Uber service to the taxi service. That makes sense. Uber was probably maybe a little bit cheaper. It was definitely much more seamless, and so on. But the whole liquid expectations, about expectations sort of, floating over into different industries, you might ask yourself, why do I have to wait in line in the grocery store when I can just take an Uber so seamlessly? Why do I have to wait in line? And that's something that, for example, Amazon right now is trying to solve in their Whole Foods stores. So the question that is on the slide right there, if Amazon, Netflix, and Uber and anyone can personalize the services, why can't universities? So if I no longer have to wait in line in the supermarket and the grocery store, why do I have to wait for so long before I get my exam results over the summer? Why can't I get them instantly? Or if I no longer have to wait in line in the supermarket, why should it be so damn difficult for me to sort of patchwork the education that I want with shopping for different courses and putting together my own educational curriculum? Or why should it be so bureaucratic to sort of set up a study abroad scheme? So that's examples on how expectations from other industries can sort of float over into and raise expectations for personalization, individualization, and seamless services also within education. I hope that makes sense, because it might seem a little bit overstated, but it's the way of thinking that's really interesting here when talking about these student consumers. And the reason that I'm even bringing this up is maybe because there are some new actors out there, some new players that are just waiting to sort of provide a better service or a better service experience, a much more seamless service experience on some of these parameters compared to the traditional universities. So that's why I'm bringing this up, actually. Okay, so one of the other factors that's driving this paradigm change in higher education, of course, is the whole digital transformation that we've been talking about in so many industries already, but we haven't really talked much about in general, in the broader sense, when talking about education. And it's really important for me to say that when talking about digital transformation of education, it is not only about the middle part here on the slide, that we are able to deliver education in new ways, we're able to sort of reorganize the educational setting in new ways, so sort of supporting how learning and education is delivered and taken on board, so to speak. So talking about digital transformation is about much more than just the learning experience. Digital transformation of education should definitely also be thought of in the context of the whole transformation of the institution, the way that the higher education institution works or operates as a business. So I hope that makes sense, and of course also the way that communities, education communities is facilitated, the whole experience thing. So digital transformation of education is both about how the business of the institution works and is being digitally transformed. It's about the learning environment, the education environment, and it's about how communities are facilitated. But of course, this whole digital transformation can be really, really difficult to sort of grasp, and there's so many examples throughout recent history, businesses and business leaders and professors and whatnot sort of being surprised about this whole digital transformation. And one of those examples you can see on this slide right here. So if we go back to 2010, the dean of Harvard Business School went out and said that the school will never enter the arena of online education in my lifetime. And you can almost read in between the lines how provoked he was by this, by someone asking him if that was a possibility. Of course not, because Harvard Business School is an old, traditional institution with a lot of legacy and a lot of value, brand value, so to speak. But hopefully, or luckily, was the word I was looking for, luckily, this guy changed his mind simply. You have one way of thinking about things until you get a new one, right? So in 2014, Harvard Business School did launch their online platform. And in 2016, this same guy, Nitin Noria, he went out and endorsed the online learning platform as the most important innovation at Harvard Business School. So that's 6 years after he sort of said that this was never going to happen, because of course it's not. And they've just, last year they had 33,000 students through their platform, and they just rebranded the whole thing, the whole platform here in the beginning of 2019. So it's really something that Harvard Business School is promoting and see as a definitely a future business model, a future part of the whole business. So that's just to sort of underline that the whole digital transformation is a difficult thing to sort of grasp. Most of you have probably also heard about Moocs as a concept, and there's been all sorts of problems with Moocs. It's those massive open online courses where everyone can sort of participate at no cost, or at very little cost at least. So you expand the reach of education, and you can do it on demand. You have a much more flexible alternative, and so on. But there's been loads and loads of problems in the early years of the MOOC. Very, very few people actually sort of finished the MOOC that they started on. So the drop-off rates were so high in the mid-90%. And of course, that's something that's you sort of held back development, and something that has to be overcome for this to be a really, really significant thing. But you are seeing already now that most universities, most bigger universities at least, are doing the same thing as Harvard Business School is doing, having an online platform with some select courses that they provide online, and that people from all over the world can sort of tap into and participate in. But it's important for me to say that if you look on all of the names on the right of this slide, we have Coursera, you have Udacity, and all of the rest. They are, of course, digital companies. They are tech companies. They're born as tech companies, which, of course, most universities are not, or all universities are not. So just, having an online platform sort of powering up education and going online, it doesn't make a university, it doesn't transform a university into a tech business. So there's some hard competition out there that really knows how to utilize our data, how to adapt, have adaptive learning programs, and really individualized services based on my strength and my needs and my expectations and whatnot. And these new players, they also sort of brought new forms of credentials to the arena. Because of this flexibility, maybe it makes much more sense to go to Udacity and take a nano degree in, let's say, AI, something that was developed in cooperation with Google or Amazon or IBM or whatever. Maybe you don't have to take a 4 to 5 year degree to be very good within AI that you might need now. Maybe you can just go and take a nano degree that is very specialized. You learn how to code and stuff like that in a much shortened amount of time and at much lower cost. And that basically leads me to talk a little bit about the whole unbundling of education. So unbundling is not a new concept, but it's fairly new to talk about it in relation to education. I think the way to best sort of give an example on what unbundling really means, what it is to talk about how iTunes, followed by maybe Spotify, sort of unbundled the music album. So back in the days, at least when I grew up, you'd have to buy a CD album to listen to that one song that you really, really liked. But you, at the same time, you had to buy the entire album. So you had to buy all of the songs that you didn't really like, just to have access to the one song that you really liked, or the few songs that you really liked. So that's the unbundling. With iTunes and Spotify, now you just have access to the songs or the tracks that you really would like to listen to. And transformed into an education setting, could we potentially unbundle the whole 4 to 5 year degree that you, for example, in the UK and in the US pay loads and loads and loads of money? So you're buying an education bundle that sort of gives you all these services, this curriculum, this mentorship programs, this social network, whatever, could we somehow unbundle that bundle so you could sort of pick and choose the services that you actually want? And it's not just talking about that you sort of pick and choose your own curriculum. Maybe it makes more sense for you to sort of outsource the whole mentorship thing instead of talking to the student counselor or at the university that you have access in the classic bundle. Maybe it makes much more sense to talk to a much more inspiring person about your career and your career development. Maybe it makes sense to add, let's say, a machine learning course to the very traditional business course that I'm doing, or the business degree that I'm doing at the Copenhagen Business School. So could we unbundle education offerings to allow for this much more flexible learning without the cost and conformity of these full degree programs? I think it's a really interesting way to think about things. And of course, with unbundling comes a whole bunch of new business models. But again, it's important for me to say that with unbundling, I'm not saying that it's going to be either black or white. Either you're going to buy a full degree or you're going to unbundle the entire degree. We definitely don't see bundled and unbundled options to be mutually exclusive. We're going to see them coexist, but we're going to see unbundling or education as a service, if you want, sort of add flexibility to the way it's thought or the way it's organized today. Which leads me to this slide right here that I really, really like, because it's a report that sort of supports some of the things that I'm trying to preach here a little bit. So looking at some of the key trends that are accelerating tech adoption in higher education, in the longer term, it is the rethinking of how institutions work, and it is the whole unbundling or the disaggregation, modularization of degrees that are sort of driving tech adoption in education, digital transformation of education in the longer run. At least this report agrees with me on that point. Which basically takes me here. To some people, this slide can be really, really shocking to look like. I presented the same slide deck last week in Copenhagen, and we had a lot of university representatives in the audience, and they didn't really like this slide. They could definitely acknowledge the importance of this slide, but of course it's not something that they like to see. I would definitely argue that the value of education is increasing based on what we've talked about so far, about changing labor markets, changing society around us. So education, the value of education is increasing, but the value of holding a degree, holding a certificate, a piece of paper that shows that you've been part of this program and you made it through this program, the value of the actual degree might be diminishing. It might be partly because, at least in the Danish context, that degrees have sort of oversaturated the market. So the ticket to play in the Danish labor market has more or less, at least for knowledge workers, become that you have to have a master degree. So it's sort of inflated in a way. And also talking about the growing number of these alternative ways, alternative learning paths to sort of learn what is needed out there in the labor market or in life to these traditional degrees, 3 to 5 year degrees, is also sort of undermining the value of holding that piece of paper at the end. And even in a Danish context or a North European context where you don't pay tuition fee, or at least very low tuition fee, there is still some opportunity cost associated with obtaining a degree. So for example, instead of studying maybe for 3 years, going out there, learning on the job, get some experience, instead many people choose to spend an additional 2 years to sort of build on top of that. And in those 2 years, there's an opportunity cost, invested time and money, of course, that is sacrificed, that could have been used maybe gaining experience, valuable experience in the changing labor market. So those are some of the things that is sort of undermining the value of taking a degree. Because when we look at the companies out there, some of the companies that are recruiting, some of the most innovative companies within recruiting, they are starting to value skills much more than degrees. So valuing what is the actual skill set of a candidate more than where did he get his degree from. And they do that. They start doing that because it's evident from research that education level is only weakly correlated with actual job performance. So that's why more and more companies are shifting away from the focus on degrees and are using these new ways of measuring employability. So for example, AQ instead of IQ. So AQ is something called the Adaptability Quotient that sort of tells you or tells the employer something about how adaptable are you in a changing environment where your job might change over time. That's one way of thinking about this. For example, GitHub, that some of you might know, it's this, what can you say, software development platform where people can sort of share their codes, their coding skills, their piece of code, and then get it verified by other coders, by peers, so to say. And they sort of give this peer review on how good you are at coding. So Silicon Valley businesses, startups, I've seen examples of some of the most innovative startups. They are starting to recruit some of their coders based on their GitHub score, and they value that much more than, for example, recruiting someone with a degree from MIT. So the one that's best with coding doesn't necessarily have to have a university degree. So again, those are some of the things that are sort of pulling in the direction to a more skills over degrees paradigm that is sort of undermining the value of holding an actual degree that takes you 3 to 5 years to obtain. These are some of the examples of some of the biggest companies in the world that have now removed degree requirements from the recruiting processes. And some of these examples are actually all the way back from 2015, I think. For example, the one in the middle, EY, Ernst & Young in UK, which I would definitely claim is a pretty knowledge worker heavy organization. They actually found out that there is no correlation between academic qualification and what you actually, how you perform in the job. They actually looked at their graduates, their recruited, the ones they recruited, and sort of found no correlations between that. Same thing with, going back to the EY example, they looked at data from 400 graduates and then they came to this conclusion. Google and Apple, it's not really what can you say, and some of the other tech companies, it's not really a surprise that they also look in new ways and more innovative ways to sort of man their positions in a fast-paced tech sector. And they've sort of found the same correlation that and this is actually a statement from the head of people, I don't remember his title, but the head of recruiting, I think is his title, in Google. That's one of the things we've seen from all our data crunching is that GPAs and degrees are worthless as a criteria for hiring new people. We found that they don't predict anything. So degrees, of course, is not invaluable, but it's just one parameter out of many others that sort of tells you how good is this person at this potential job. Good. Moving on here to sort of allow time for everything, talking about some of the new actors that are sort of shaking up market dynamics in higher education. I'm going to give you some examples that are, if you are members of the Institute, you can go online and you can download the actual report. There are many more cool examples in the report that I have time to sort of present here. But these are some of the examples of both ed tech startups that sort of comes in and disrupts things a little bit, but also examples of actors that normally lies without the realm of higher education that is sort of creeping in and competing in that market. and of course we'll have to mention the two big ones, Google and Amazon. They're everywhere, right? So Google has a for education umbrella, and Amazon have an education umbrella. And under these two umbrellas, they have loads of initiatives. For example, the Grow with Google, they train people in digital skills. Of course, it's not a degree or anything, but they train them in digital skills because they figured out that most jobs in the future will have a digital component, or at least, interaction with technologies. And for example, in Copenhagen, they've physically manifested themselves in sort of higher education by opening a learning center right in the middle of Copenhagen, on one of the busy streets in Copenhagen. And they've managed to train 10,000 people in digital skills in Copenhagen in just 1 year. And these physical learning hubs, they've dotted them out across selected cities across the world. So they are physically saying, okay, we're here, we're ready to take on the fight in the education sector because we see that there's a big market, not only in higher education as initial education, but definitely also in corporate training. Same thing with Amazon. They have loads of initiatives, and just recently they've recruited what they call a director of learning science and engineering. And for what I could read out of this, the one that they recruited for this position was Candace Tilley, and she is described as a leading expert within learning science, cognitive science, and open education from Stanford University. So to me, this sort of smells a little bit like an arms race that's going on right here. So Google and Amazon as tech companies, they're creeping in more and more industries, and now also creeping into the whole higher education or education sector in general. And how do you compete with tech companies with new business models and much more, effective data usage than you have as a traditional institution? LinkedIn, which is owned by Microsoft, they are slowly also evolving into an end-to-end learning platform because they sort of have people on their platform where they can they have access to what the companies on their platform, what they have in their job postings, what are the short-staffed sectors, what are the skills that they need. And with that data, they can sort of offer courses for the people looking for jobs on the very same platform. So they're evolving into this end-to-end learning experience platform. And just recently, I think it was this year actually, they developed this new initiative called Skills Insights. So now they've actually developed a tool that companies can use to examine the skills they have in-house. And of course, when a company finds out that we need these and these and these skills, with that tool, they're going to go to LinkedIn to sort of buy the education, buy the courses to close those skills gaps. So it's a very clever ecosystem way of thinking about what is our role in the education sector. Degreed is an edtech startup. It is a few years old by now, but it's sort of going back to the whole skills over degrees discussion right here. So they've developed a sort of a lifelong learning platform, and they want to sort of end the way that we think about that your competence level is defined by the credentials that you have. In this model, in this platform they've developed, they are going to sort of, what can you say, certify you the skills that you actually have, whether you learned them by having an interest for a topic, or whether you learned them being a football coach with young kids, regardless of how you earned the skills that you actually have. So they develop the model where they have experts validating your skill sets. They have machine learning validating your skill sets. So your skills profile is defined by much more than just the degree that you have from a university. A completely different example here, WeWork. You could sort of argue that they are also a tech company, WeWork. They were definitely born as one. They recently rebranded into We Company, because WeWork, as you would know it, it's these on-demand, very cool co-working spaces where all the cool entrepreneurs and all the cool small businesses, they sort of have access to co-working spaces in a very creative way. But in the We Company ecosystem that they're building right now, they've also added the We Live, flexible modern day living options, and they've also added the We Grow. Right now, I know it's only elementary school that they're sort of piloting this whole concept We Grow on, but it's to sort of try to create synergies between the very dynamic and innovative working environment through mentorships, through all sort of partnerships, and creating these synergies with how we educate people. At the same time, they've also ventured into a partnership with something called 2U, which is an online learning platform. And that is to make higher education accessible to its community members, so to the people that sort of use WeWork or the We Company services. And the reason they're doing this is that they acknowledge that we're all students for life, and this partnership creates incredible opportunities to foster lifelong learning, back to the whole lifelong learning thing. And pundits from the outside, they've described this as WeWork just turned its global network of workspaces into a community of learning. So that's another example of an actor or a player that you wouldn't normally say is a force to be reckoned with within higher education, that's suddenly sort of finding their way into and finding their space in this very lucrative market. This one I'm going to skip just to speed things up a little bit, because I want to also talk about a very cool chapter that we wrote in the report, where we sort of did this thought experiment. What would education look like in a post-scarcity society maybe 50 years from now? And just a post-scarcity society, real quick, is a fictional future society where the technological development and automation has sort of made it not necessary to sort of have manual labor anymore. So everybody has access to all the basic services they need to live a fulfilling life. You don't have to work anymore. Maybe people choose to work because they like it, but essentially the post-scarcity society is a society where everyone has access to basic services and basic needs to live a full and a rewarding life, so to speak. So if you no longer, if we think this thought experiment through, if you no longer have to go to school to get a job, why would you then go to school? What would be the purpose of education in such a society? And it's basically playing with the thought of, if we look towards a future that looks completely different from the world today, that's changed in so many ways. I'm not saying that this is a wildcard scenario, as you see. I'm not saying it's going to be like that. But if we look towards a future that's completely different from today, we would probably also look to education being way different, or at least the purpose of education being way different from what it is today. We had a lot of fun developing this scenario right here. So if it's no longer labor market participation that sort of is the main motivation to pursue higher education, what would it then be? Would it be to sort of create a meaningful life because you're now able to study something that really makes sense for you, and that without caring about if it leads to a job or if it leads to unemployment or whatever it leads to, so you can now just study what you find to be most interesting and that sort of creates a meaningful life for you? Or would the purpose of education, would that be to sort of build resilience in an ever-changing environment, and then maybe futures literacy, sort of being much more aware of future, what can you say, future changes, maybe even climate literacy, who knows? Maybe the most important thing of pursuing higher education is to solve the climate change in the future. If we no longer have to work and then we no longer have to sort of strive for economic growth, maybe climate literacy becomes the main purpose of education in the future. You can read much more about this fictional scenario in the report if you have access to that. Which basically takes me to the last few slides right here before I start answering questions. Because talking about resilience and futures literacy, to me, is much more important than talking about what are the skills that we need in the future. I don't like to talk about what the actual skills are that we need in the future. I know a lot of people like to do that. World Economic Forum, for example, they have future skills outlook, so you need to be more creative, you need to be able to problem solve and so on and so forth. But to me, it's much more about mindsets than it is about actual skills. Because how can you talk about skills for jobs that you don't even know? So having a mindset that's prepared for change and that helps us thrive in a society that's characterized by constant change and complexity. And be aware that I'm using the word thrive, I'm not using the word survive. So it's about the whole mindset for change and complexity. And also the whole sort of capability of being able to proactively acquire the new skills and competences when the need arises. So no longer maybe going to school to learn a whole bunch of things during university that you might need at some point, but maybe in a much wider and more holistic sense, learn how to learn. So learn how to acquire these skills when they actually, when the need arises. And the whole thing about futures literacy that enables people to sort of better understand the role that the future plays in the decisions that we make today, so the future becomes less frightening in a sense. And that essentially sort of closed my presentation today. I'm going to go back to the beginning slide here, and then I'm going to invite for questions for the next, let's say, 10 minutes before we need to leave here. And I see there's already one question in there from Sarah from Germany. And she's asking, don't you think it's that it's problematic that these all are private actors which are all biased? And yeah, I started out by saying that in this report we really tried to be explorative and not normative around it. But if you ask for my normative opinion, I definitely agree with you that it is problematic and that it is a development that needs to be sort of supervised. And it's also something we're seeing right now that, at least at the EU level, that we are trying to sort of slow down these giants and the way they use our data and so on in a much wider sense. So yes, I do think it's problematic that if future of education would, or higher education would solely be in the hands of private actors with their own agendas of making money. I totally agree on that. But I don't necessarily see a future where that would be the case. I think a much more realistic future would be where, or in the future-proofed higher education, I see these new actors playing a role in terms of the whole flexibility, but I also see the traditional institutions playing a huge role because they have the brand value, they have the traditions, and I don't see them being eliminated as such. Again, it's to me, it's not that black or white, but I see them coexisting, really. And maybe in partnerships, who knows? Thanks for the question. Please post questions in the chat. And I'm gonna wait around for maybe 5-10 minutes more. And if questions arise after we close down for today's session, feel free to reach out and email them to me, and we can always take the live dialogue from there. Remember, you're still all muted. I can't hear you, so you have to write it in the chat if you have questions. All right, and the moment that I see you guys starting to log out, I'm just going to wrap things up and say that that this was it for today, and I hope that you at least got some new perspectives of some of the things, and that I challenged your mindset around some of these things, because that is the main purpose with this report. I see. Okay, it was just me that didn't know how to scroll down here. I'm so sorry. There are more questions. I'm just reading a question now from Victor. What incentives were found from your exploration to motivate seniors to join a lifelong learning process? we didn't specifically look into the senior part of society, but we looked more around, if our working lives in the future are much more fluid, and we'll be living for so many more years and we'll be working for so many more years, then we will probably change careers much more often, maybe because we're automated out of our jobs, maybe because new opportunities arise. So that in itself, I think, will be a main motivation for seniors to join lifelong learning. Because this is actually referring to a different project that we've been doing at the Institute, but talking about the new third age, that the third age being sort of the period from where you stop working as a senior until you sort of, your body starts to deteriorate. There's an expanding amount of time where you're actually living really cool lives. You're able to do a lot of stuff. And for most seniors, just going from 100 to a 0 and retiring from one day to the next is not the way they would like to spend the rest of their days. So that in itself motivates people maybe to take on lifelong learning, or to take on a new senior career that's maybe different from what they did when they were a successful, let's say, business leader during their career. I hope that was a question, that was answer enough, because I'm going to move on to Santini's question. What are the strengths you feel universities have that they should be building on, based on your thoughts on the changing education landscape? Definitely the legacy. But I think it's crucial that universities and these traditional institutions, they sort of at least start to rethink the role they might play. Maybe they are not the ones sort of selling or providing full degree programs in the future. Maybe they take on a role where they maybe facilitate or they curate maybe even curriculums or learning experiences from all of these actors around, because I'm not being overly optimistic on maybe my own or maybe the individual in general's abilities to sort of mix and match their own curriculum in a coherent way. So there will be a role for facilitating or curating the content, but maybe they're not the ones providing the actual content to the learner. Maybe some of these new actors are much better at doing that in flexible ways and in more innovative ways. All right, so there's a question from Fernando. How might the public institutions and the private sector work together to develop workable solutions? Fernando from Aarhus. Talking about the private sector, I'm not too sure if you mean employees in general or if you mean some of these private actors that are coming into the education market. But definitely, if you talk about public institutions as universities and the private sectors as the employees that people are going to work for, that are going to recruit the students, or you're saying private actors, so some of the new actors coming in to the education landscape. Sort of, I'd say the answer to that question I sort of addressed before. Maybe if the universities sort of rethink their role and cooperate in new innovative partnerships with some of these actors, there might be very, very good solutions to sort of go hand in hand. We are already seeing how some universities are partnering, for example, with like unlikely partners, like different startups within the online learning. So it's no longer, let's say, University of Aarhus. I don't know if that's the case, but the University of Aarhus providing the actual online education, but maybe they partner up with someone else that can do it much better, maybe Coursera or edX or whatever. So there definitely are ways they could partner up. So Victor is just clarifying here that he knows that Harvard and Yale are inviting seniors back to study alongside younger students, which is a very, very cool way of doing things, because there definitely is ways that they could learn from each other. But in the actual report, we also have a text box in there that seniors, or the way that you learn when you age, is way different from the way that you learn when you're younger. So there are some things to be aware about there, and you can read more into that if you have access to the actual report. But thanks, Victor, for chipping in here. So I guess I have time for one more question. yeah. Or if people are satisfied, I'm just slowly going to close this down and say thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you found it interesting. I hope it sort of challenged some of the views that you had, and I hope it brought some new perspectives, because that's what we're here for. Please reach out if you want to continue the dialogue, or if you have additional questions. Thanks so much. I'm gonna close it down now.